It says in Mark 15:34, at 3 o'clock, it's in the afternoon, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Theologians have discussed this at great length, but it actually just shows the agony that Jesus went through.
This is the Gospel of Mark, which is the second book of the New Testament, but we think was the first Gospel to be written. Mark is the shortest of the four Gospels.
In the Bible, Matthew comes first, and then Mark, and then Luke, and then John.
But although it's the second Gospel, it may well be the first Gospel that was written. There's lots of debate as to when it was written.
School teachers foolishly used to say Mark is bad Greek. It's not bad Greek, it's simply a colloquial dialect, and Matthew is much more formal than Mark in his use of language.
Scholars now think that Mark probably came first. It took them quite a while to come to this conclusion. I was told that there was a long resistance because Mark's Greek is the crudest and the simplest, and they just did not want him to come first because they did not admire his Greek style. Okay, how do they figure out who comes first? It's quite a fun process, actually. You look at particular stories that occur in both, say Mark and Matthew, say which came first. You look at particular stories and you look at the way they've been changed from one to another, and you assume that some kinds of change are more likely than others. So it's more likely that a story will get smoothed out later on, that it'll get added to, that the embarrassing bits will be taken away, that it'll get moralized. There's certain kinds of things where you say it's more likely that it develops in one direction rather than the other. It's not a science, it's not certain, but there's quite a strong consensus among scholars.
And in Mark, what is absolutely fascinating is that at the beginning, the first 6 or 8 chapters flashes by very quickly. In fact, one of the frequent words that's used is immediately. He's dashing on to the next thing.
And it's a wonderful gospel in the sense that the speed at which it goes.
Jesus always goes suddenly, comes suddenly, without any rhyme nor reason. His movements are very mysterious. Whenever Jesus heals somebody, he says, "Don't tell anyone." He wants it to be kept a secret.
And if you actually read through the 16 chapters of Mark, it goes at quite a pace. Often it will say, and immediately he did ...
And then Peter confesses him as Messiah, and it begins to slow down a bit, which means start thinking about this. And the middle is really about who is Jesus.
So what is interesting about the Gospel of Mark is that from the 2nd century onwards, we have a close connection between the Gospel of Mark and Peter. So we have a Christian writer writing at the beginning of the 2nd century of the Common Era, and he tells us that Mark has written down what Peter preached in Rome, and that he summarized it in the way he understood it. And that means Mark is seen in this early tradition as the Gospel of Peter.
One of the really distinctive themes of Mark's Gospel is the weakness and failure of the disciples. So there's story after story where Jesus wants the disciples to do something and they fail, or he asks them who he is and they don't recognise him.
Okay, so another famous miracle that takes place on this body of water is where Jesus calms a storm. So for example, in Mark 4, we hear about a storm being raised on this water, so a dramatic turnaround from this kind of glassy scene that we've got here. So the idea that Jesus is asleep on the boat and the disciples are absolutely petrified. The disciples are sort of seasoned fishermen, but they're still terrified by this storm on the sea. And they worriedly come to Jesus. And in Mark 4 it says, they wake him up and say, "Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing?" So Mark, really blunt here. "Jesus, what are you doing?" He woke up and it says, he rebuked the wind and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." Then the wind ceased and there was a dead calm. And he says to them, "Why are you afraid? Have you still no faith?" And they were filled with great awe and said to one another, "Who then is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him?"
So the 12 disciples come across as a rather weak and feeble bunch. And this gives us quite a few clues as to who the Gospel of Mark was written for and when it might have been written.
Another story in Mark 6, where we have the idea here of Jesus walking on water. So Mark 6 verse 47 talks about the evening. When evening came, the boat was out on the lake, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that his disciples were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them, early in the morning, walking on the lake. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the lake, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid."
If it focuses particularly on this issue of the weakness of the disciples, we therefore think that it was probably written for an early Christian community who were getting a bit lazy and who thought that being a Christian was actually quite easy and it was all fairly obvious who Jesus was. So Mark writes this gospel pointing out how easy it is to fail as a disciple of Jesus. So we've got perhaps an indication of a debate amongst the very earliest primitive Christians, probably in the 70s AD, something like that.
Another mysterious feature of Mark is the young man. There is a young man in the Garden of Gethsemane where Jesus goes after the Last Supper to pray.
Well, behind us we have some very old olive trees, which is, probably the oldest olive trees on the Mount of Olives where we are right now. And so this has become one of the sites for the possible Garden of Gethsemane story in the Gospels.
When Jesus is arrested, the young man is grabbed and he runs off, leaving a mysterious white robe in the hands of the person who grabs him.
All his disciples forsook him and fled, and then a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked.
It's also a young man in a white robe, and it's the same word, sitting inside the tomb, who tells the women that Christ is not there. Who is this white? What is this white robe? Who is this young man? Again, my interpretation would be that this is a clue to the reader. It says, pay attention. It's traditionally been associated with Mark himself because it doesn't fit in the story. It's never explained, almost as if it is a figure for the book itself. What will you do with this story? How will you interpret it?
So that mysterious character may be Mark writing himself into the story.
Yeah, exactly. And in a way showing that he was at least at some bits of the ministry of Jesus there and a kind of eyewitness.
And then towards the end of the gospel, the whole thing changes round, because Jesus, so to speak, becomes a passive recipient of what other people are doing to him. And so, of course, he's betrayed by Judas Iscariot. He's tried, he's crucified. So you have this big switch over from lots of activity in the first part over to this passivity and the suffering of Jesus.
Mark is not particularly distinctive. He does mention these last words of Jesus on the cross.
When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. At 3 o'clock, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani," which means, my God, why have you forsaken me?"
Which is a direct quote of the opening lines of Psalm 22.
On first sight, this looks like a cry of utter despair. My God, why have you forsaken me? God's forsaken me, I'm crying out. My last thing I say. He gives a loud cry, he doesn't say anything else thereafter. But it turns out that my God, why have you forsaken me is also the first line of Psalm 22.
In Jewish practice, whenever you hear the beginnings of a biblical passage, that what that evokes then is the whole passage. It's a bit like a kind of worship code word. You start off with this one phrase and then everyone replies with the whole passage. So when we hear Jesus quoting the scriptures in this way, we think, well, he's probably evoking the whole passage and not simply those first lines. And those first lines are desperate, aren't they? My God, why have you forsaken me? Why have you given me up? And yet if you go on and read the rest of Psalm 22, it's a psalm of enormous hope, of the God who knit me together in my mother's womb is the famous saying. You've known me from the beginning and have never let me go, even though as compared to you, God, I'm nothing.
Some people say, actually, that cry is an affirmation of faith. But scholars don't agree. So we don't actually know. These last words of Jesus, these really strong words, is it a cry of despair or is it an affirmation of faith?
And what is very, very striking is that a little bit later, we read that Jesus breathed his last, chapter 15, verse 39. Now, when the centurion who stood facing Jesus saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was God's son." It's very, very striking that a centurion, i.e. a Gentile, a non-Jew, should make this confession. And what's very interesting about Mark's Gospel is that it was probably written from Rome. And Mark's Gospel has this evangelistic intent. So Mark wants people to be converted by reading this. And so probably his hope is that every Roman, every Gentile will be able to make the same confession. Truly, this man was God's son.
In terms of interpretation, no one would want to deny that the cross is anything other than apparent defeat, dead loss. It's desperate. It was the means of execution reserved for the worst criminals by the Romans. And you have to remember that Christ, according to the Gospels, is crucified outside of the city walls, on the road leading out of Jerusalem. And often in pictures, what you see is just 3 crosses on top of a hill, and they're just there alone. In fact, it wouldn't have been like that at all. The whole road would have been lined with crosses, with people crucified on them as signs from the Roman military occupiers. This is what's going to happen to you if you break our laws. You will be crucified. So the whole road is just lined with people crucified, taking days to die. So everyone knows this is utterly desperate. Why have you forsaken me? This is where God is not. God is to be found in the middle of the city, in Jerusalem, in the temple. This is the place where God had promised to meet his people. Jesus is crucified outside of that, away from that, with the lost.
One reason this is interesting is in Christian theology, in ongoing reflection on the Bible, there's this question, how are we saved? Or what does Jesus have to do with salvation? Within a Christian context, clearly Jesus has a lot to do with salvation, but exactly how it works, what the mechanism is, how it makes sense, this is something that theologians have struggled with for more than 1,000 years and carry on struggling with. Now, in recent thinking about this, there's been one person who's been a very exciting voice and very important voice has been Jurgen Moltmann. He's been very influential, widely read, just quite an important Protestant theologian, Protestant German theologian. And he has quite a vivid conception of what went on the cross, that actually what's most important on the cross is that God in Jesus is being abandoned by God the Father, that the very experience of God-forsakenness is the center of the cross. So it's not so important that Jesus suffered physically. I mean, it's important, it matters. Jesus suffered physically, Jesus suffered the betrayal of his friends, Jesus was the victim of an injustice, all these things. But what's the deepest truth going on there is that God himself is taking on the experience of God-forsakenness.